ever thought about how God created everything from nothing? In Genesis chapter 1, we're told that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what does that mean? Did God just kind of click his fingers and boom, there was a planet? I mean, it could be. That's possible. But there are other indications in the text that perhaps God used a process. We read this in Genesis 1:11 through 12. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Basically, God caused the entire vegetated biosphere to sprout up from the earth, most likely from seedlings or seeds. I mean, this is amazing. And there are other indications in the text as well. Of the land, it says in Genesis 1:9 and 10. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. Clearly, processes were involved in gathering the waters into one place, and the movement of the land into the atmosphere. That the waters were gathered into one place seems to be indicative of natural movement of water under the influence of gravity, which is going to be important later. Now, other examples from Genesis 1, like God's creating Adam from the dust of the ground, lack a sequential series of events that we today would identify in terms of process. But the text certainly implies that at other times God used processes. And I've called this supernatural formative processes. So what are supernatural formative processes? Well, importantly, they involve processes, but not just any kind of processes. The Genesis account strongly suggests that many of these processes were patterned on the natural processes that God would later use to sustain the universe, where water, for example, is subject to gravity, where plants and trees grow from a less developed counterpart. And that brings me to the second most important part of supernatural formative processes. They are clearly supernatural. The rate at which creation unfolded was clearly a supernatural act that can only be accepted by faith. It turns out that supernatural formative processes occur all through the scriptures. So, for example, in Numbers 17, you've got all the leaders of the tribes of Israel, and they're coming against Aaron and Moses. But God puts an end to this little rebellion by causing Aaron's staff to flower and bud mature almonds. It says this in Numbers 17. "Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms and yielded ripe almonds." Now, notice that the almonds grew as per our experience, where there was a sprouting of a plant, then buds, then blossoms, and then mature almonds. The sequential nature of these processes was somewhat natural, apart, of course, from the rate at which they grew. And notice also that these almonds, interestingly, did not need any nutrients, water, or sunlight. This is a perfect example of supernatural formative processes. In the New Testament, there are also examples. I think of the fig tree that withered in Matthew 21:19. We're told that a fig tree withered and died overnight. Now, to have a fig tree wither and die overnight means that some kind of supernatural process was at work. In Acts 3, we're told that the apostles come to a lame man. Now, this guy, he's lame from birth. And you know what legs look like on lame people? They're really, really thin. And the reason they're thin is because they haven't used their muscles since the time they were born. So they come to this guy and they heal him. And it says in the scriptures that his bones literally received strength. Although not stating it, we must also believe that his muscles grew and his tendons became strong. And there are other examples as well. There's the restoring of a withered hand in Mark 3:47. Atrophied retinal cells are regenerated in John 9. Lazarus's body's been dead. It stinketh, says the King James Version. I mean, this guy is rotting. And yet, Jesus regenerated his body. And then, of course, there's the Lord's own body itself. Supernatural formative processes are real in Scripture. Now, some important details about these supernatural formative processes, and that is that in each instance, they all tended to retain a natural history. Now, think about the almonds. If you took those almonds to a scientist, to a lab, and had them check it out, what would they tell you about the history of those almonds? Well, they would probably tell you something like, well, yeah, this is a bunch of almonds that came from an almond tree. It grew in soil over 5 years because that's how long it takes to get mature almonds. And he'd be wrong. I mean, you see, those almonds retained a natural history. What about the legs of the lame man? If a doctor came and looked at those legs, there's no way he would believe that he was lame from his mother's womb. That's because the man's legs retained what appears to be a natural history. The fig tree, it withered overnight. Well, fig trees don't just wither and die in 24 hours. It takes several days or even weeks, even if you give them poison. This was something that happened at a supernatural rate. Importantly, supernatural formative processes shouldn't be described in terms of appearance of age or mature creationism. Well, how is that? Well, first of all, let's have a look at the example of our planet. So our planet, as you probably know, it has a core, it has a mantle, and it has a crust. But have you ever thought about how God brought that into being? Well, scientists believe that the crust kind of separated out of the mantle. And they've done operational kind of science to demonstrate that that is the case. Essentially, think of some very, very dense rock. Imagine that that is mantle rock. And if you heat up that very, very dense rock, eventually some of the minerals are going to melt. And the minerals that melt first are those that are lighter or those that are less dense. Things like quartz and plagioclase. And where would these less dense fluids go once they've been sort of pulled out of that mantle rock? Well, they're sort of going to go up because they're lighter, they're less dense. It's going to go up to the surface and become crust. And that's how geophysicists believe that we get the crust. The core is produced through another set of processes where very, very heavy elements are sort of drawn down into the center of the planet. And they call this differentiation. And that's all very, very, very interesting. However, remember that that's a secular interpretation. But it's a really, really good one, and it explains a lot of things. Well, now imagine that a secular scientist goes along to the Canadian Shield. Now, the Canadian Shield, and as far as I know, all creationists believe that the Canadian Shield is creation week rock. If a scientist goes out there and picks up a rock, what do you think he's going to hypothesize about where that rock came from and how long it took to form? Do you think he would sort of look at that rock and say, wow, well, I guess that came into existence in 2 days? No, most likely not. He would think, because he sees a lot of process in that rock, that that rock formed over millions of years. And that's because humans interpret process in terms of time. And you see, this brings us then to the difference between mature creationism, appearance of age, and supernatural formative processes. Mature creationism and appearance of age, they're static terms. They don't tell you anything about the way God made things. And that's a problem. If you say something has the appearance of age, just like God kind of clicked his fingers, boom, and there was a core, well, that's just sort of telling someone that God made it like that because he's into the distressed look. That's not good. But if we apply supernatural formative processes, then God used processes during creation week to differentiate out a crust and to differentiate out a core. And this makes sense because God's creative strategy was to create a mature planet in 6 days. And of course, that means there's going to be a lot of process involved. So when our scientist goes out to the Canadian Shield and picks up a rock and sees a lot of process in that rock, he is going to interpret that process in terms of time. So you see, it's not about appearance of age. That's the wrong way to think about it. If we think in terms of supernatural formative processes, then God used supernaturally accelerated rates to differentiate out a core and to differentiate out a crust from a mantle, because that was his creative strategy. And so when we see those processes, those specially created processes in specially created and or altered things, we can't interpret them in terms of time. So what do we do then? Well, we've got to be told what happened, and that's exactly what God did in Genesis chapter 1, Exodus 20, and numerous other passages. God told us that he made the heavens and the earth in 6 days, in literally 6 days. And since God and his creative strategy was to make a mature universe in 6 days, he had to tell us, otherwise what would we think? So I hope that's helpful to you. Instead of just telling someone, well, I guess God just made it with the appearance of age, now you can tell them, well, actually, he made something very, very quickly, because that's what he wanted to do. And if you make something quickly, well, there's a lot of process associated with it. And since we as humans naturally interpret process in terms of time, that's why people says it looks old. Now, importantly, that's why people say it looks old. Sometimes people often accuse me of saying that God made something purposefully to look old. No, he made something rapidly with a lot of process. And since we interpret process in terms of time, it's people who think that it looks old. Now, at this point, someone might say, well, what about Jesus's wine? There was no series of sequential events that led to the formation of that wine. There was no tree, there was no vine, and there certainly was no fermentation. Well, how does this example fit with supernatural formative processes? And you know, that is a great question, and I'm going to answer that one in part 2. Don't forget to check out my book on this subject. I also have a blog, Creation Unfolding. I've got a Facebook page, the rest of the YouTube videos. Hit the subscribe button because therell be more videos coming. All right, thank you very much. Goodbye.
But again, he has a website, creationunfolding.com. He has a YouTube channel. That's what this came from. And so he's constantly posting things. And what I like best about him is his Australian accent. So, you know, I just love, I'm a sucker for an Australian accent. So I don't know who directs my driving map, but I have an Australian accent. Yeah, the voice is an Australian accent. So, and when I have things read to me on the scriptures, it's either an Irish accent, a Scottish accent, or an Australian accent. So that's just me. If it's in Spanish, I prefer an Argentinian accent to any other accent. So I usually, before I buy a book in Spanish, I sample it to make sure they're not a Spaniard. No offense to you Spaniards, but I prefer the Argentine accent. So anyway, that's me. Anyway, so what he was talking about is this is something that the whole book is on, and what I like about his book is it's a combination of technical science in the early on chapters, and then as the book goes on and you start getting these concepts down, he starts simplifying it. And the last few chapters are really easy reading. And my hope is that he continues to write, because I think he's onto something that's just, it really bridges the gap. When you read the old earth people and you read the young earth people and you read him, it's like he's pulling all these pieces together. And I really like that. So as far as I'm concerned, I think he's really worth at least reading and thinking about, especially with reference to the days in Genesis 1. And I think he's able to explain it in a scientific way without compromising what the Bible actually says. So that's my view. But again, I'm here to tell you, I wouldn't die for this, okay? I would die for the fact that God created. But as to how he did it and how long it took and that kind of thing, I think that's just a debate we're going to have until we get to heaven and get to ask Jesus. And I can't wait to have all the Christian scientists there and see their mouths drop when Jesus says exactly how he did it. And I think, and it's not just going to be creation and how he did it. I think it's going to be our eschatology. There's going to be certain things that we think we're right on now, but we're not. But again, the most important thing is that we're right on the gospel and who Jesus is and who we are in relationship to him and so. So any questions on the video that you just saw? Comments, questions? What did you think?
I thought it was great.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Good.
Just a perfectly clear explanation of end time.
Mm-hmm.
And God's the Father of time, so that makes perfect sense. I mean, we see things, and he spoke so well about that, the humans see, we judge things by time.
Yeah.
Because everything is related to time, our bodies and everything else.
Yeah.
Only the way we see it.
Yeah.
But God is over and above.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've, again, I don't know how many of you've witnessed miracles right in front of your eyes, but you've heard me talk about when I was in India in 1999 and saw a guy's arm grow back. And I thought about that in terms of what he's saying, that if a doctor showed up after his arm completely grew back and evaluated his arm in light of the other arm, I don't know that he would ever be able to discern the fact that that guy's arm just grew back from evaluating that current arm. I think he would view it in terms of the history of the other arm and how old he was and the whole thing. And he would be wrong. He would be wrong in his evaluation because in reality what I saw happen was a supernatural formative process where I saw a guy's arm grow back. I don't know how long it took. I think looking back, it was probably like a 3-minute process. But again, 3 minutes is a very quick process in comparison to however long I grew my arms. It took years.
Was everybody watching?
Yeah, there were 11 other witnesses that were with him, and then there was a witness that was with me. So there were 14 people total, including him. He got to see his own arm grow back. Yeah.
So what does that say about the aging then of some of the people in the Bible? They live to be 100, 120. So right, it's along those same lines.
Yeah, again, I think the environment was such. Again, I don't know enough about that to know exactly how that works scientifically, but I think the fall has had ramifications for decay that weren't there before the fall. Pretty much all Christian scientists would say that, but they'd probably have different theories about that as well. Yeah.
I don't want to say clever, but this explanation really it acknowledges what, as scientists, how we can identify natural processes.
Mm-hmm.
So this takes all of that, but just realizes that, but God's supernatural part of it is that He can speed that up.
Yeah.
So this is really good.
Yeah.
It's not got to throw out what real science can say.
Yeah. And again, what I like about it is like when you read young earth guys that say that God created things with age, I've never been real happy with that. And I've never been real happy either with him making things mature either. But the idea of him creating with a process that, again, when we observe things over time, we see that process. But again, that God could do that quickly. I think it's impossible not to acknowledge that. And as a matter of fact, it makes sense of the fact that when God makes the new heavens and the new earth, I don't think we see that. I don't think it's going to take billions of years. He can do that. Why can't He do that? Because He's already done that. So it makes sense of the beginning and the end. Whereas I think any other position really doesn't make good sense of the beginning or the end. And you've got a lot of problems. Whether again you're saying that God created things with age, because again, God can't be deceptive. But again, it's just understanding that, yes, we do have to, as Hebrews 11 says, that without faith it's impossible to please God. It does take faith. But I would also tell the evolutionist has, I think they have more faith than we do, because they're believing that all this came, I mean, again, it's a slow miracle.
Yeah.
What's going on now is really a really slow miracle. It's still a miracle. And they don't even have a designer behind the miracle. They don't have, they just have to say it came about by accident or chance. And I think, to me, that takes way more faith than, again, to say, if I pick up this watch in a forest, I'm going to know this thing didn't just evolve. I'm going to know there's a designer behind it. Even artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence is all the rage now, and that's where everything's going technologically and everything. But it's not really artificial intelligence. It's intelligence by design. It's intelligence by intelligence. It's not intelligence by chance or by accident. And so again, I just think that we have better answers to reality than the naturalist does. And it takes less faith. Yeah.
Okay, my question is not really a question, but so
Comment? Yeah.
oh, it's kind of a question about talking about explaining this to people. But I realized when you talked about there's a natural decay because of the fall in the earth, and then I was thinking about global warming and all these things, but how there's a supernatural element of just gradual destruction, and there's those who don't know the Lord, they're oh, we can save it, we can restore it.
Right.
Yeah, and that there's maybe some level of we should be aware and that we could be more aware, but then there's just no way to save the slow decay of everything, and no one can kind of deny that there's a gradual destruction occurring of life.
Yeah.
But I guess there's a level of this answer is so good, but then it's also so supernatural, and it's almost awesome because it's as Christians we can't explain things through a naturalistic way to some extent. It's God requires us to be able to explain faith in how we talk about science and stuff. But then as Christians, when we talk to non-believers, we get the reputation that we ignore science a lot, and then it's pretty intense to be oh yeah, so let me explain to you this supernatural formative processes, miracles to
Yeah.
a scientist. And how would you recommend Christians go about, not that we need to debate or convince people, because there is a level of faith in the gospel to share these things, but as believers in the regular world, how do you think that we should, what is the best way to talk about these things when there's such a level of faith?
I think for me, what helps me is reading, honestly, what helps me with, in particular in the area of science, is reading books by scientists that have become Christians through their study of science. So one really good example, now he's not a scientist, but he's a philosopher. His name's Anthony Flew. And the last book that he wrote was with someone else. I can't remember who the co-author was, but basically it's sort of it's his autobiography, but somebody's writing biographically about him because he was older. I think he was in his 80s when he wrote this. But he was considered the most notorious atheist of the 20th century, Anthony Flew, a British philosopher, and debated pretty much a who's who of Christian, debaters and all kinds of religious people out there too. But he ended up becoming a theist. So he believed that there was a personal God primarily through his own personal study of science in his 80s. And I don't know if we're going to see him or not. I don't know if that led from being a theist to being a Christian at some point. There's some people that think so. But he's a guy. Another guy that I recommend to everybody is, again, I think the best critique of evolution that's ever been written that I've read is by Michael Denton. Michael Denton is not a Christian, but he acknowledges the possibility of theism. Because in his study as a biologist at the highest levels, He's taught at the major universities around the world as a scientist in biology with a PhD. He's published in the biggest scientific journals and everything else. But in his own study, he finds that biology is too complex to be able to explain naturalistically. And so that there has to be an intelligence behind it. So he is part of the intelligent design movement. Michael Behe is Catholic. I don't know if he's a Christian or not. I've never really heard him explain the gospel or his testimony or anything like that, but he's a part of the intelligent design movement. And his book, Darwin's Black Box, which came out in the 90s, is considered probably the most well-reasoned critique of evolution for the layperson that's out there. Michael Gillen, who is a graduate of Cornell in physics, is a Christian. And he worked for either ABC, NBC, or CBS, one of the big three, although I don't think they're so big anymore. I haven't watched any of those networks in 20 years, but I don't know which of those is the biggest one, but whichever one's the biggest one, he was the science expert on those shows. So if scientific things came up or scientists were on there, they would go through Michael Gillen. And Michael Gillen's first book was Can a Smart Person Believe in God? And what he does in that book is he shows that in his study of science, there's no other answer than God. So there's people like that out there that are really smart. They're in the sciences. Another guy, again, I'm giving you a bunch, but you asked. So I just think this helps me, because if I read those guys, and again, I can't retain them as well as I can retain baseball scores and baseball statistics. I wish I could, but I can't. But when it's fresh, or if I know I'm meeting with somebody that is, and I do this with anybody. If I know I'm meeting with a Mormon, I'll read Mormon material and how to reason with a Mormon. Just to remind myself, I know a lot of this stuff already, but it's a little dormant because I haven't used it recently. It's like any of you who've taken languages, you've lost a lot of that because you don't use it. But if we all moved to Costa Rica and were there for a year and lived with a family that only spoke Spanish, we'd all pick up a lot of Spanish, just because we're around it and we're hearing it and we're using it. So, but another guy that I was going to say, science-wise, it just crossed my mind and then it went through my mind and it's somewhere else now. I had it and I lost it. Anyway, maybe it'll come back to me. But again, that's what I do, Joy, is in areas that are not my expertise, I try to read Christians or people that are sympathetic, at least, to Christianity, that are wrestling with whatever the issue is, and read them so I could understand what they're dealing with. Because if you get a PhD in even biologists don't agree on even though they're biologists, they have different areas of expertise in biology. So they can't even really critique each other because they're not an expert in what the other person's an expert in. And that's part of the problem is we think that scientists are really smart, and they tend to be. I mean, you can't really get a PhD unless you have some level of, intelligence. Unfortunately, common sense doesn't always go with that, but but I do think that that's part of the problem is you have a lot of people that we automatically assume that if they're wearing a lab coat, they know what they're talking about. Well, they might know what they're talking about maybe in their specific area of expertise, but oftentimes there's just as much a layman in discussing astronomy as a biologist as we are. If we've studied a lot of astronomy, we may know more than a scientist who's not necessarily an astronomer, but just through our own study. And so I don't think we should shut up because we're not experts. I think we should challenge people on any belief that has obvious loopholes. And again, for the evolutionists, the reality is what they believe is only a theory at best, and it's not a very good theory. And as a matter of fact, evolution, if Darwin came alive today and he was on the scene, what evolutionists are saying now is completely different than what he was saying. Their arguments, they don't use any of the arguments that Darwin used. So they're still evolutionists, but they're a different kind of evolution. Their argumentation for evolution is actually different than Darwin, because Darwin didn't know very much. I mean, all the stuff that's been discovered since Darwin, he didn't know the complexity of DNA and cells and everything else. Yeah.
I know this isn't question and answer time, so I'll just keep this very brief, but it seems to me that every time, and going back to Joy's question, you're asked about this by an evolutionist. Usually they can give you, well, global warming is this, and if you look into that, and I believe in this because of this, you can look into that. But they give us about 3 minutes and 12 seconds to verbally vomit everything we know.
Yeah.
And we fall into that trap.
Yeah.
And try to get everything that we know out in 3 minutes and 12 seconds instead of backing up and saying, these are my beliefs. If you want to know more, this is why.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And again, I'm the type that I'll often have people read things because, again, even Colson, like, I can do an okay job of explaining, but he does a much better job himself. And when you read it, obviously it's going to go deeper than what we're doing now. And again, I highly recommend his book. I just think if you're in this class, you're interested in this. If not, you wouldn't be here. So I think I pretty much can almost guarantee that you'll really enjoy the book. You'll get a lot out of it, and then you're going to be, you're going to follow him on Amazon. So when he comes out with something new, you'll see it and you'll get it, because he's just a really good communicator and really illustrates things well, and that's his field. So I think this is, for me personally, this K.P. Colson's the best thing going right now. Among all the things I've read by way of science. Another thing that I like to do with non-believing friends is, and I do this with believers too, is it helps me to grow. So I'm doing this with a few people. As a matter of fact, Tyron and I are going to start reading a book a month. So he picked the first book, and we'll discuss it at the end of next month. And then I'm going to pick a book, and we'll discuss it at the end. And I do that with a bunch of people. But I also do that with non-believers. And what I'll do, so I've done this with people that are really into science, is they'll give me Carl Sagan stuff and Richard Dawkins stuff. And then I give them, my stuff. But what's good is, I think a lot of times we're not exposed to things, and I think it's courteous of us to that's a way of listening to somebody. If somebody says, I'm an evolutionist and here's why, and we just completely dismiss that, then what's to stop them from dismissing whatever we're saying, right? So I think it takes work, but hey, if you can get somebody out of hell, I think that's a pretty good job done, Again, ultimately that's up to God, but he does use the means of our witness and our apologetic to lay down the barriers, to break down the walls. So I think it's just a courteous thing to be able to say, and I do, when I'm talking with a non-believer that's interested in doing that, I'll say, you pick the first book. What book do you think is going to convince me to be an evolutionist? That's what I want to read. And I'll read it, and like the whole time I'm reading, I'm like, God help me. This is like reading a stop sign over and over again. It's just like, I usually hate it. Very seldom has anybody given me a book that's a non-believer that I enjoy reading. It's like going to the doctor or the dentist every day for an hour. It gives you a shot, and it's just miserable. But then I have to look at, okay, well, next month he's going to read my book, and he's probably going to feel the way I do. But again, I've had some success with people coming to Christ doing that. And again, I just think you want to build bridges with people. The goal is not to win an argument. Who cares if you win an argument, but you lose the person? The goal is to win the person. And C.S. Lewis is a great model of that. If you read biographies of Lewis, everybody he debated that I know of, they loved him. They didn't agree with him, but they loved Lewis. They wanted to have beer with him. They'd go to his favorite bar, afterwards and talk, and they'd have a good old time and tell jokes and whatever. But they loved Lewis because he really modeled the fruit of the Spirit. And I think that's the most important thing. Yeah. It's not the argument is secondary. I think the way your attitude towards somebody and the way you come across is even more important. Yeah. So, yeah. Good. All right, well, let's go ahead and go to the good questions and good discussion. Let's go. This is only 3 pages, so we're going to make it. But just follow along as I read. Okay, so this is K.P. Coulson, and this is an article from the website, from his own website, creationunfolding.com. And so here's what he says, and again, you're going to learn some Hebrew here too. A subset of 3 major positions: Old Earth creationism, Young Earth creationism, or theistic evolution. And so pretty much almost everybody falls into one of those camps if you're a Christian. Old Earth creationism suffers from its commitment to long ages and the death of animals before the fall of Adam and Eve. Interestingly, most Old Earthers reject any form of Darwinian evolution. They believe that Adam was a historical figure created from the dust of the ground, and that Eve was created from Adam. They also believe in the historicity of the fall and the reality of original sin. Because Old Earthers are committed to these essential biblical doctrines, I tend to find myself sympathetic to their position. I disagree with it, but I don't think Old Earth creationism is necessarily heretical in nature. Still, my prayer and hope is that Old Earth creationists eventually adopt a Young Earth position. Theistic evolution, unlike Old Earth creation, is, I believe, a dangerous philosophical worldview. Theistic evolutionists clearly deny the historicity of Adam and a literal fall of humanity into sin. Not only do such claims contradict the clear teaching of Scripture in both the New and Old Testaments, the very nature of theistic evolution is diametrically opposed to the purpose of redemption. Why do humans need to be redeemed when they never sinned in the first place? My prayer for theistic evolutionists is that they completely reject every facet of this heretical worldview. Young Earth creationism doesn't get off so lightly, however. I've been intensely interested in the Young Earth creationism ever since I was first saved at the age of 25. Let's just say more than 25 years ago. This passion so engrossed me that I decided to pursue a terminal degree in earth science. But over the past 10 years, I've been more than a little disappointed with Young Earth creationism in general. Most of my struggles are directly linked to the cavalier way in which many Christians who hold to a young age view address the issues of origins. As a science professor, I get to have all sorts of interesting conversations. During many of these conversations, I'm usually reminded about all the problems within modern science. According to these people, we can't trust anything that the secular scientific community says. None of them know what they're doing, and most are out to wantonly hide the truth from the ignorant public. Young Earth creationist scientists need to help the general public understand that for the most part, science is good and secular scientists are not the baddies. The baddies, as I call them, are those that have a specific platform or agenda that is outwardly aggressive towards Young Earth creationism. Most scientists, however, are not baddies. They're just normal people who love science and want to contribute to humanity's love affair with knowledge for the purpose of furthering many aspects of human endeavor. The authority we as Young Earth creationists stand on is the Word of God, not science. As such, we don't have to be afraid of the data, but we do need to handle it with transparency, humility, and integrity. So I don't know about you, but I just really like his attitude. Yeah. You know, I like the fact that he includes himself in, we've got work to do here. You know, we don't have all the answers. We're figuring this out, but let's give each other some grace. And I just really like his approach. So the importance of process. So another problem with most forms of modern young earth creationism is that it makes no room for processes that were at work during the creation week. Most young earth creationists just assume that God spoke and poof, out came a planet or a star or a tree ex nihilo. The main reason this straightforward approach exists is because most Christians are not scientists. They're just normal people who are either unaware or uninterested when it comes to how science interfaces with God's created universe, and that's not a bad thing. Begin to dig into the natural order as a scientist, however, and things are no longer that simple. The nature of the creation account itself indicates some kind of accelerated processes. On day one, the earth was in its most basic form before being shaped into a geologically mature planet that could sustain life. God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. Genesis 1, 9, and 10. These processes involve the movement of vast volumes of water and sediment. That the waters were gathered into a single location seems to suggest a commitment to basic laws of hydrology. Although this example is a little ambiguous in the details, a more biblically explicit example of process is described for the creation of plants on day 3. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Genesis 1, 11 to 12. Commenting on this verse, Old Testament Hebrew scholar Klaus Westermann says, the earth brought forth the effect of the command, so that's vatotse haaretz deshe. Let the earth put forth vegetation is described in detail in verse 12 with the word vatotse, the earth brought forth. The meaning of the bringing forth is primarily, let something which is within come out. And the plants are in the earth, and the earth lets them come forth. William Barrick in the Old Testament, he's an Old Testament Hebrew scholar. He actually teaches at the Master's Seminary, so he's good buddies with John MacArthur. And Young Earth Creationism, he's a Young Earth Creationist, says this is in his commentary, Genesis 1 to 11. By the way, that's not out yet. I've tried to get it over and over again. It's just not out. He's been working on it for like 10 years. So I don't know if he's going to get done with that when I finish Genesis or not. But anyway, I wish it was available. But anyway, let the earth sprout. So haaretz tzadeh, or actually that's tzadeh haaretz, might indicate God had already created the seeds for all these plants. He might have done so at the very moment he caused the land to rise out of the global ocean. The sprouting implies a process by which the seed germinates and the sprout pushes through the soil to the surface to grow and leaf out. Although there may have been an actual process take place, it took place at a much faster rate than it would thereafter in the normal order of things. All vegetation, including large trees, is said to have matured in the period of just a single day. More importantly, these processes seem to have had an undeveloped starting point. The vegetated world grew from seeds, or at least from seedlings buried in soil, and then into fully mature seed-bearing organisms. Danny Faulkner, he's an astronomer with Answers in Genesis, agrees. He says, it is clear that some aspects of instantaneous ex nihilo creation are within the creation account, such as the initial creation of matter in the beginning. But it also is clear that many aspects of the creation week involve processes. These processes are not to be confused with the supposed gradual, undirected, and naturalistic processes of evolution. Rather, the processes of creation week were rapid and directed by God to complete his purpose within 1 week. Faulkner has gone a step beyond that of Baumgartner in proposing some kind of highly accelerated processes for much of the creation. Faulkner gives his theory the name Dasha, after the Hebrew word translated to sprout from Genesis 1:11. Okay, so that's just a quick, simple explanation of this whole idea of supernatural formative processes. And again, Jesus turning the water into wine, God healing a withered hand, blind people being, all those things involve supernatural formative processes. So it either happens over time. Again, the evolutionist believes in the miracle of what we have over time. They don't call it a miracle, but I do, because I just don't see how we get us by chance. I think that takes tremendous faith. And again, neither of us were there, but we do have the advantage of God telling us what happened. And ultimately, we have to believe what we believe as far as origins by faith. But it's faith in what? On what basis do you have faith in your belief in what you believe about origins? But there's no doubt it takes faith because we weren't there. We didn't see it, Okay. Any questions? Yes?
Well, just a comment. Was it me?
Yeah.
Okay. So this really narrows the argument beautifully. Like you just said, they believe in a miracle. They might not admit it,
Right.
but they have to.
Yeah.
Because it's everything out of nothing, and so the whole process. We do disagree with the process, though, of evolution, where species jump rank, go into other things.
Right.
That's like Greek mythology.
Yeah.
So there is a difference.
Yeah.
But this narrows the argument when you're talking to somebody to that point.
Yeah.
Of time. I think every snowflake is different, right? And they're formed instantly.
Yeah.
And they're extremely complex.
And what's interesting is if you talk to most non-believers, they will grant, for instance, at birth, if they've had a child and they've been there, obviously the woman's there, but if the guy's there, I've talked to a lot of guys that are non-believers, and I say, what would you call that? What would you call birth? And they almost every time say it was a miracle.
Yeah.
So the reality is, I think people are more inclined to believe in miracles than they think, than they even realize. But again, we're so indoctrinating people to be naturalists that but again, I think that we need to push people on these things, because ultimately, I think to get where we're at, again, it's a very slow miracle, is what it is. If you believe in evolution, it's a very slow miracle. So we believe in miracles. Let's agree on that. But then, what's the evidence? What do we find by way of evidence? And I think we've earned a right to, at that point, talk about this. And I don't think it's far-fetched. Because again, I think it's less far-fetched than all of this came by chance, or again, that something can come from nothing, which is ultimately what they have to say. So good, yeah.
I was just thinking our perception of time can be really messed up, because if we're running late, time goes really fast.
Yeah.
Waiting for an important phone call,
Right.
it goes really slow.
Yeah.
That's a good
Yeah, sure.
I was just thinking that, for me, the picture of the time-lapse photography example
Yeah.
kind of helps, because I'm not very scientifically inclined, it kind of gives me a picture of how, because I always find those pictures so amazing.
Yeah.
To see a flower just come from the seed,
Yeah.
And so anyway, I just think the timing of
And that's one of the things I like about his videos. His videos are very visual. He gives a lot of, I haven't seen all of his videos, but I've seen probably a dozen of them. And almost all of them, all the 12 I've seen have visuals to it. So it helps you, again, I'm not very scientific myself either, so it helps you really go, oh, that's what he's talking about, and that makes sense. And again, another guy that's really good that I like, his name Kurt Wise, and he has 66 class sessions that you can watch for free on YouTube, all on biology. So, and he does all these visuals and experiments and everything. But again, he's a young Earth guy, Harvard grad. You know, he has a PhD from Harvard in biology, but he's a young Earth creationist. And so he explains biology from the perspective of Scripture. And I think he's really good to watch because, again, he explains things, but he has visuals for everything. So again, if you're interested in that kind of thing, again, almost everybody we talk to out there buys into some kind of evolution. So in order to be able to have dialogue, I think the more we know, the more we can have to say and can have an educated conversation with them.
What's his name again, the biologist?
His name's Kurt Wise.
Okay. So is there a new school for Colson School?
I hope so. I hope he gets more of a following. Right now he doesn't have a huge following, but he's, this book just came out last year.
Okay.
And it was towards the end of the year. So I was grateful that it came out when it did, because again, I'd probably be espousing something a little bit different than this, but to me this really makes sense. And really helps you to understand more where the old Earth guy is coming from, where the young Earth guys. Yeah.
So you would critique what he's doing a little differently?
As far as I'm concerned, I don't have anything to critique on what he said. But he himself says that young Earth creationism is relatively a young school of thought. It's young, and we don't have the millions of dollars coming in from the government to back us up. So the biggest problem for people like him is money. They don't have financial backing. And they don't get a platform because nobody's going to hire him. Nobody's going to hire this guy to be a geologist at their university. Even most Christian schools won't even hire him because most Christian schools buy into theistic evolution or old Earth. So the young Earth position is the minority position in academia. It's not the minority position among your average lay Christian. Your average lay Christian, I think, is still a young Earther. But the scientists themselves are not going to get financial backing, and they're not going to get a high position in academia if you're a young Earth person. So what he's saying is we got a lot of work to do. And we have to be able to explain the science in such a way that a scientist can say, okay, I could see that. But until they're able to do that, we're just going to still have this, headbutting that is taking place.
This is kind of simple. The camera accelerating the growth of a flower. And I never really put it together. But that's done through mankind. We saw it with our own eyes.
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense that God, being the ultimate power,
right.
do that.
And yet it takes intelligence. It doesn't happen by chance. Somebody with intelligence has to be able to speed up that process. And again, we can do that with technology. God can do it without technology. Yeah. Good. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Good. Anything else? All right. Spencer, good to see you. You got any questions on this? I don't know when you walked in. Did you see the video?
Yeah.
Okay, you'll see it in the service because I'm playing it again. Today's sort of all on this subject. So, all right, good. Well, let me pray first, and we get off a little bit early. You have time to go to the bathroom between now and service.